This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
It just reminds me to introduce the speaker, who is very well known to all of you, I'm sure, but I will nevertheless introduce Vanessa, who's Professor of London History at Birkbeck, University of London. She works on late medieval and early modern London, as all of you, I'm sure, will know, and has published extensively on quite a wide range of topics, including death and burial, demography, families, households, the built environment. But in addition, she's also been working on this character, Richard Smyth. I won't spoil it by giving any more information about Richard Smyth. Just to hand over now to Vanessa to talk about A Quiet Life in a Turbulent Century, Richard Smyth of London, 1590 to 1675. Vanessa.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you all for coming on not quite the coldest day of the year, but getting on that way. So my paper today is part of a wider project, which is to explore the history and society of 17th century London, in part through following through the life of this individual, this 17th century Londoner, Richard Smyth. And of course the first thing to say is that if you're going to follow anybody's life, it's just as well if they're not called something like Smith. Castlemaine, for example, it's a lot easier. Or other names that people have pursued. What I was intending to focus on for this paper, when I was talking to Matthew about it at the beginning of last term, was the fact that he lived a surprisingly quiet life through one of the most turbulent centuries that London has known. War, plague, fire ravaged the city in which he lived, but he continued to live peacefully, to prosper in his professional and social life, and to die aged at 85 in 1675. Although he was, so to speak, on the wrong side of the divisions of the middle of the century, being Anglican, Episcopalian and Royalist in sympathy, he nevertheless retained his employment by the Puritan and parliamentary city of London. He must have been hit by the taxes and shortages of the Civil War years and by the interventions in political and religious life of the Civil War, Commonwealth and Protectorate period, when, as we know, for example, London's church and parochial structure was radically attempted to be changed. But he was able to weather these, apparently without too much difficulty. His house in Little Moorfields was outside the area burnt by the fire in 1666, though the neighbourhood must have been affected for some years by the presence of the dispossessed and homeless Londoners who were camping out in Moorfields. His life wasn't without upset and loss. 5 of his 8 children died in infancy, childhood or adolescence. He was predeceased by his only surviving son, by both his sons-in-law, and by his beloved wife of over 40 years. But overall, he was still able to thread his way through this seemingly cataclysmic century of war, plague and fire to enjoy a prosperous, settled and I think quite happy life. So as I say, I've been aiming to talk about this topic fairly broadly, but I began by focusing on plague, and I find I've really got more than enough to say about Richard Smyth and plague in 17th century London. So that's really what I'm talking about today. His experience of, his response to plague, how this tells us more about early modern Londoners and their interaction with the period in which they lived. So Richard Smyth is principally known to posterity as a bibliophile and a book collector of note, but I think he's of wider interest for a variety of reasons. He was a resident of London for at least 60 years, for over 30 years in the centre of the old city, later in the northern suburb. He was clearly a betterment or professional migrant. He benefited from education and connections provided by his family, but he made a success of his own subsequent career. And I think he belonged to that new class of professionals, civil servants, lawyers, perhaps physicians, who were beginning to live off fees and salaries, and who, together with the prosperous merchants of the city, were beginning to create a new urban middling sort. He was born in Buckinghamshire, the eldest son of an Anglican clergyman of the same name, and indeed both his father, his grandfather and his great-grandfather were all called Richard Smyth. He was educated at Abingdon Grammar School and briefly at Oxford, though I think he didn't take a degree there. He came to London in around 1609 or 1610, when he was about 19 or 20, and obtained a clerical post in the Poultry Counter, which is one of the city's courts and prisons, through a family connection. Over the years, he rose in seniority, finally attaining the post of secondary of the Poultry Counter in 1644, which is an office of both responsibility and profit, effectively acting as under sheriff, head of a staff of law officers and clerks. The office was said later to be worth £700 a year, which is a phenomenal sum, derived from a share of the fees and profits of justice in the counter. I haven't found any direct confirmation of this figure, but it is actually, I think, the most expensive of the city offices to buy. Let's say they're venal, and it seems to be the one that you have to pay most to secure. Ironically, I don't think he actually did pay to secure it, but because his predecessor was dismissed and he was appointed in 1644. But he certainly was able to sell it afterwards. He served as secondary until 1655, when, following his son John's death, he sold the office and he retired. He clearly intended to pass it on to his son in a way that was quite feasible at the time. He married in 1620 the daughter of a Stepney merchant, and they had a long and happy marriage. From the 1620s to the early 1650s, they lived in Old Jewry, the lower of the two stars. I don't know whether you can see at the back, whether the marks, near Guildhall, where they brought up their family. In the early 1650s, they moved to Little Moorfields in the parish of St Giles Cripplegate, it's the higher of those two stars, outside the city wall. In 1666, he occupied a house of 7 hearths in or near White's Alley, between Gun Alley and Ropemaker's Alley. And this is actually quite a nice place to live at this time. Little Moorfields is open to the bigger space of Moorfields itself. White's Alley was described in the early 18th century as a good, handsome, open place, well built, some of the houses having gardens under them. And obviously a house of 7 hearths was well above the average for this parish, indicating that he occupied a comfortable and spacious dwelling. Well, spacious anyway. In 1664, his beloved wife Elizabeth died of jaundice. During her last illness, she'd been nursed by her sister-in-law, Mary Edney. And Smyth's household as a widower, so for the last 10 or 11 years of his life, may have included Mrs. Edney and also his widowed daughter, Martha Hacker, and her 2 teenage daughters, who were certainly in frequent and familiar contact with him. His son's widow, Mrs. Anne Smyth, also seems to have lived nearby. Not far away in Whitecross Street in the same parish lived Richard's wife's niece, Mary Holker, married to a scrivener, William Harby. Richard's younger brother Walter, also a scrivener, with whom he had a warm relationship, lived in Ludgate Hill. And in fact, London seems to be peppered with connections and relations. It's a very good place, in a sense, to make and reinforce the bonds of family. It's not that people were separated from their entirely separated from their backgrounds when they came to London. After his retirement, Richard Smyth was free to pursue his passion for book collecting, which he'd begun much earlier, and he built up a large and varied library and a wide acquaintance among London's booksellers and printers. And as well as collecting books, in his retirement he was working on various compilations and transcriptions, making much use of works in his library. His manuscript account of English bishops was largely completed in 1658-9 and then updated in the early 1660s. And in a sense you could say this is a labour of love, because when he was putting it together there was no certainty that there would ever be bishops in England again. So it's almost a sort of elegy for the Episcopal Church that he might well have thought was never going to recover. Also in the 1660s there seemed to be several fragmentary library catalogues that he himself compiled. It also seems likely that the manuscript catalogue of all such persons deceased, which I'll say a bit about in a moment, was written up presumably from earlier notes in about 1663. He continued to add to it till a few weeks before his death in March 1675. And although this isn't strictly relevant to what I'm saying, it looks as though he was in pretty good form right up to the last, even at 84, 85, because between November 1674 and his death in March 1675, he read through the newly published catalogue of the Bodleian Library and marked it up with books that he had that they didn't. A very impressive thing, particularly when, since I think its organisational system is different from his own. So it looks as though he's sharp and on the ball right up to the end. Although he didn't leave any personal writings as rich and as detailed as the notebooks of Nehemiah Wallington, with which many of you will be familiar, let alone the diary of Samuel Pepys, there are 2 major sources that make the reconstruction of his life and connections feasible. And the first of these is the manuscript that he compiled and entitled A Catalogue of All Such Persons Deceased Whom I Knew in Their Lifetime, wherein are set down the several years of our Lord and the days of the month when every one of them died or were buried, from the year of our Lord 1628 successively. And this is what has come to be known as Richard Smyth's obituary, because that was the title given to the Camden Society edition published in 1849. And what it is, you can't really see from this, but it's a sort of personal parish register, a list of in chronological order, a list of the names and dates of death and burial of about 1,900 people. Included in the list are family, friends, neighbours, legal and professional colleagues, booksellers, and some notable individuals. He usually includes a little more information than the bare name and date, either an address, an occupation, or some note indicating the interest of the event. Over time, the record becomes rather fuller. By the later 1660s, he's sometimes adding details of the funeral, such as the preacher, the text, or invitations and things. And the list runs almost without a break from 1628 to a few weeks before his death in 1675, though, as I said, it looks as though it's all been written up together in the early 1660s and then continued. And it can be used to trace the chronology of his life and the networks of family and other connections outside London. He left his book collection to his daughter Martha Hacker, who was his executrix and his residuary legatee. And on her death in 1681, she left all my library of books to her infant grandson, or for sale to support his education and upbringing. And the family obviously decided to sell it at that point. And it was sold at auction in 1682. And the sale catalogue, whose title page you see here, Bibliotheca Smithiana, was put together by the bookseller Richard Chiswell. It lists over 8,000 printed items or lots, several of them being actually bundles of pamphlets, and 177 manuscripts. Chiswell described the collection, this is an advertisement, as perhaps the best and largest collection of that kind that is in any private library in this nation, so that the most learned men in these parts were wont frequently to have recourse to this for things not to be had elsewhere. One of the many surviving copies is the auctioneer's record, this one on that side, which contains the names of the purchasers and the prices paid entered on additional slips of paper. I mean, despite the distortion, you can perhaps see that that one has been extended with paper pasted to the outside edges. So we not only know what was in the collection, we know who bought it and how much they paid for it. Although the sale catalogue did contain some books which had been added by the auctioneer, which is known, and there were some published after Smyth's death in 1675, it's likely that the great majority of books listed had actually belonged to Smyth, and so the catalogue gives insights into his intellectual interests and his scholarly preoccupations. More than half the books were in Latin, and in addition to the English books, there was also a large quantity of tracts, booklets and pamphlets, mostly in English, sold in bundles. His scholarly interests were wide-ranging, eclectic, focusing on history, especially church history and the polemics of the Civil War period, theology and bibliography, with a noteworthy collection of incunabula and early printed works. And he had quite a large collection of medical works in both Latin and English, and a few on natural history and science. And as other sources for his life, there are brief memorials of him, for example, from Wood's Athenae Oxoniensis and elsewhere, wills, parish and city records, some of Smyth's own papers and unpublished writings, and a range of manuscripts and books that once belonged to him, which are now quite widely dispersed. And what I hope to show in this is that there may be more of these than had once been supposed. But what I was going to focus on is Smyth and his experience of plague in 17th century London, how a life lived over several decades in London may have been affected by the recurrence of plague. So as a long-term resident of 17th century London, he encountered several episodes of plague. This, taken from Paul Slack's book, Impact of Plague, actually covers most of his lifetime in London, starting with the plague of 1603 and running up to 1679. So he arrives about this point, just when that little phase of plague is coming to an end. He lived through the epidemics of 1625 and 1636 when he was living in Old Jewry, and that of 1665 in St Giles, Cripplegate. I don't know anything about his experience in 1625, though his parish suffered 25 plague deaths out of a total of 43 that year. There were no plague deaths reported in that parish in 1636, which was overall a much milder epidemic, especially in the city centre, than either 1625 or 1665. The 1640s, as you can see, saw several years of raised plague mortality, though never a full-blown epidemic, and he recorded in his catalogue 1 or 2 deaths from plague in 1641, 1644, 1645 and 1646, including one in Old Jewry in 1644. In 1647 he recorded 6 plague deaths, 2 of them outside the city but 4 closer to home. But 1665, of course, was a different matter. Overall, 68,596 of the 97,306 deaths recorded in the bills of mortality between the 21st of December 1664 and the 19th of December 1665 were attributed to plague, figures that seem very likely to underestimate the real totals. St Giles, Cripplegate, it's a little slow. St Giles, Cripplegate, which is marked with a star, is a large suburban parish, and it's very hard hit by this epidemic. It has one of the worst mortality rates per household, as well as huge numbers overall. The fact that only part of the parish lay within the city's jurisdiction, that its resources were low in comparison to its population, contributed to its problems. The parish's population on the eve of the plague might have been as high as 25,000. In 1665, over 8,000 people died, with 4,800 of them, or 60%, dying of plague. Deaths attributed to fever, spotted fever, dropsy and other diseases were also far above normal. The first plague deaths in the parish occurred in early June, nearly a month after the disease had first appeared in the northwestern parishes of London, but they rose rapidly in July and throughout August. And the worst week in this parish for plague deaths was the 22nd to the 29th of August, when 842 people died, 602 of them of plague. Deaths then declined through September in this parish, though they're still quite high elsewhere, and continue to fall in October, though the weekly plague deaths only come down to single figures in late November. And in January 1666, the parish vestry noted that the huge local mortality had overwhelmed their burial spaces and began to look for ground for a new churchyard. So although his own household wasn't touched by the plague, the epidemic had a major impact on Smyth's circle of family and acquaintance. In the early 1660s, he was recording some 30 to 40 deaths a year in his catalogue, and in 1665 this rose to 169. 104 of these, he noted to have died of plague, with 2 more suspected but not reported to the authorities. The first plague death he recorded was that of his late wife's niece, Elizabeth Hulker, at her sister Mary Harby's in Whitecross Street in this parish on the 4th of July. The second, suspected but not returned, was the parish sexton on the 5th of July. 2 weeks later, on the 16th of July, he noted the deaths from plague of Mary Harby's child and its nurse. Mary's husband, William Harby, died of plague on the 9th of August, but Mary herself survived. Smyth's former maidservant, Nell Hutchins, died of plague, as did her mother and stepfather, and her sister, who actually died at the pest house. Mrs. Edney's sister died, and the son and daughter of Smyth's old friend, Mrs. Muschamp, in Shoreditch. Smyth's neighbour, Mr. Ward, passed on news of the death of his own brother and his 5 children. Smyth recorded the deaths of acquaintances across the city, especially people associated with the book trade and the law, but many were close at hand. The sexton of Cripplegate Parish, one of the church wardens, the parish clerk's wife, Smyth's pew fellow, Mrs. Durant. Several deaths occurred in White's Alley and in neighbouring Gun Alley and Tenter Alley, and in all, at least 35 of the plague deaths he reports were in Cripplegate Parish. So that was his immediate and real experience of plague, but there's also, for someone, perhaps not surprisingly, for somebody with his passion for books, his experience of plague was also in part through text and print. He lived through plague, but he also seems to have read quite extensively about it. And the sale catalogue of his library contains a large number of plague-related items. In English, it lists Simon Kelway's Defensive Against the Plague, Thomas Thayer's Treatise of the Pestilence, James Manning's New Book of the Pestilence, James Barmford's Dialogue Concerning the Plague's Infection, Thomas Cogan's Haven of Health with a Preservation from the Pestilence, all of these dating from around the 1603 plague. The catalogue also lists 10 several treatises of the plague and various sermons and prayers in time of plague. Now, I suppose we can't be certain whether or not he owned these works, but he did own copies of the popular remedy collection, A Rich Storehouse or Treasury for the Diseased, by A.T., practitioner in physic and surgery, published in 1631, and also John Woodall's The Surgeon's Mate, published in 1639, both of which have quite large sections on plague. We know that he annotated his copy of A Rich Storehouse, but we don't know which bits he annotated, whether they were the plague bits or others. The section of the library sale catalogue covering medical works in Latin includes works on the plague by Varro, Cardano, Donzellini, Duchesne or Quercetanus, Fuchs, Fumanelli, Goclenius, Ingracia, Kircher, Laurentius, Lione, Mindra, Odi, Raze, Setela, Silvaticus, Valentius and Zovello, ranging in publication date from 1555 to 1659. The catalogue lists the 1665 edition of Dima Brooke's 4-volume Tractatus de Peste and Nathaniel Hodges' Loimologia, published in 1672, an account of the 1665 plague in London. We can certainly prove that he owned at least 3 of these by the way they're referred to in the catalogue, or the fact that they're referred to in some of his own manuscript catalogues. We also know he owned at least 2 copies of the College of Physicians' Pharmacopoeia Londinensis and a copy of Leonhard Fuchs' De Medendis Morbis, published in Basel in 1558. And I think there is actually a very close correlation between the items listed in the printed sale catalogue and the ones that we can trace in his own manuscript catalogues. Not absolute, but pretty close. Now, we don't know how he used any of these works. Some of the 16th century ones were perhaps of bibliographical rather than practical interest, and several of the English language works were printed well before his arrival in London, let alone his likely use for them. We don't know much about the sources for most of his collection, though there was clearly a lively second-hand and antiquarian book business in 17th century London. But a direct interest in plague and plague writings is shown by his transcription or translation of a handful of 16th century plague treatises and works. It was probably in 1665 that he copied out by hand translations of the treatises of Andreas a la Cuna of Segovia and of Leonhard Fuchs of Tübingen. In October 1665, he translated 2 sermons of the 15th century scholastic theologian Gabriel Biel, probably from his own copy of an early 16th century printed edition, on the question of whether it was lawful, morally or otherwise, to flee the plague. He also transcribed, or translated, a tract by the Dutch theologian André Rivet, written in 1636, various extracts from various different sources on the plague, and a tract by Ludovicus Berus, printed in Basel in 1551, all largely on the moral response to plague and the question of flight. And it's not easy to discern why he did this, or what he got out of doing it. Copying out extracts and compiling interesting or useful information was certainly his style of proceeding. So, for example, he made a compilation of Wonders of the World, which covered topics from the Holy House of Loreto to giants and pygmies. And he also transcribed other complete works on more than one occasion. I suppose that translating a treatise from Latin into English might have made it easier to consult or refer to, though there's nothing about these that suggests that they were working or sick-room copies. As regards content, both the plague treatises, dating from the early to mid-16th century, were largely humoral and Galenic in diagnosis and advice, recommending moderation and treatment according to one's constitution. And similar material to this was still being published in mid-17th century London. Fuchs also introduces the question of flight. The 3 adverbs, quito, longe, tarde, leave quickly, go far off, return slowly, are better than 3 apothecaries' shops well stocked. And flight, in his view, was as lawful as leaving famine or a house on fire. Gabriel Beale presents arguments both for and against flight, concluding that as long as duty and charity are fulfilled, it is all right to leave the city during plague. André Rivet's epistle covers a range of topics, including churches and plague burial, but also discusses whether and for whom fleeing the plague may be lawful. Ludovicus Berus, on the other hand, while allowing that those whose duties are fulfilled may flee, may leave London, or may leave the city, argues that overall it is better to stay, and that if you stay, it doesn't lay you open to the charge of suicide or self-slaying, which is one of the elements of the argument. Patrick Wallace fairly recently discussed the topic of flight, definitely one of current interest in discussion. Popular hostility to those who seemingly abandoned their social and moral obligations was being tempered by other perspectives. As far as I can see, Smyth did not leave London in 1665, though he could probably have afforded to do so, and he didn't have any post or employment that obliged him to remain. So perhaps this made him more sensitive to the topic, but he doesn't tell us directly anything about his decision or his choices. The Rivet-Berus manuscript also contains several short extracts from a variety of sources, some of them references to historic plagues, some focusing on the transmission of plague in or by means of garments and clothing. Some of them refer to pagan or Turkish fatalism in the face of epidemic death. And some of these can be linked directly to works that are in the Sale catalogue. So this is as far as I got with thinking about Smyth and plague until a couple of months ago, when I was looking at some broadsides and bills of mortality in Guildhall Library. And here I will pause just for a moment to say a bit about the genre of plague broadsides. Mark Jenner and Joseph Montaigne have written about these, and this is a popular print genre in 17th century London. These are single sheet publications, and they are, as you can see, a visually attractive, pretty sophisticated mix of text, image and numbers, brought out, I think in almost all cases, during an epidemic. They clearly draw on Londoners' familiarity with the terms and format of the weekly and yearly bills of mortality, but they reformulate and represent mortality data in a conscious visual design. They originate in or before 1625. They appear in variant but often clearly related forms in 1636 and 1665. I mean, some of them are virtually reprinted in the next plague year. And they mostly survive as single examples in scattered collections, along with other plague printed ephemera. And one particular type, the composite bill, of which I suppose those two are typical, combines typographical design, an image, prayers, advice, and mortality figures. And one particular example, is the several of them bear the title "Lord have mercy on us," or a similar form of words. Others are entitled "The Red Cross" or "The Morning Cross." And this is one particular example of these, published in the late summer of 1665 by the printer Thomas Milbourne of Jewin Street outside Aldersgate. This is a single sheet broadside entitled "The Morning Cross" or "England's Lord have mercy on us." And as you can see, it features a large Greek cross that I think is a deliberate reference to the crosses painted on people's doors during plague, framed by text that discusses the cause of plague and historic plagues in England and elsewhere, with a necessary prayer for this present time at the foot of the sheet. In the middle of the sheet, tables present the weekly mortality figures for the plague years 1591, 1603, 1625, 1636, 1637, the yearly total for 1638, and weekly totals for 1665 up to the 29th of August. The figures for the week ending the 29th of August are given for individual parishes within the walls, outside the walls. And the printer has left some blank space in the column following for the reader to continue entering weekly figures. And this tacit invitation seems to have been taken up by an anonymous Londoner who transcribed onto his copy of the sheet weekly mortality totals from the 29th of August 1665 up to October 1666. It actually looks to me, and I'll come back to this, as though he added the 1665 totals all at one time, possibly from the yearly bill for 1665, which would have been published at the end of December. But those for 1666 appear to have been added week by week. And he appears to have endorsed the broadside with the title and opening phrase of the bill ending with 1665. And this particular item is one of about 30 surviving commemorative bills and plague broadsides now in Guildhall Library in London. A few dating from the early 17th century, but most from 1636 and 1665. Several of them bear handwritten titles on the back in a similar hand to the annotations on this. A few of them contain additional writing on the face, including another commemorative bill, London's Lord Have Mercy on Us. In all, at least 15 of the 30 items, mostly 1636 and 1665, have some kind of annotation or endorsement, several of them in what appears to be the same 17th century hand. And together they suggest a reader or readers with a direct interest in the plague, some grasp of mortality statistics, access to the varied output of London presses over a period of time, and a method for storing and retrieving documents. And obviously what I'm about to suggest is that the anonymous annotator of this copy, and indeed of some of the others, is indeed Richard Smyth, and that we can link what he's doing with these bills of mortality with some of his other interest, both life experience and bibliographical experience of plague. He's not the only person to engage with these broadsides. There are several examples annotated in hands that I'm quite sure are not Richard Smyth. But it's still quite useful, I think, to give a name and a backstory to one of the people who was doing this, and to see how that extends our understanding of the reception of this genre by early modern Londoners. So there are various things that support, or I believe support, this identification. And the handwriting is the first thing that occurred to me. I mean, I was looking for something else, I came across these, I thought that's very like Richard Smyth's handwriting. We have several securely attributed autographed manuscript works of Smyth's, including the catalogue, which is the one on the left. Now, even though it's distorted, I hope you can see that things like the way in which he spells January, the way he makes a single capital F for February rather than two small Fs, which is still quite common, the way he forms his M's, the way the M's are formed, are all quite similar. There's really quite a lot in Smyth's handwriting scattered across various places that makes it seem quite a good identification. But it's certainly important to say that he doesn't have a single consistent handwriting style. He uses a variety of running and more stylized hands, including imitations of italic and black letter type in his compilations and catalogues. And like many 17th century lawyers, he does of course have a proper formal signature. You wouldn't necessarily think by looking at all those separately that they were by the same person, but there's enough linking them for us to be fairly sure that they are, that apart from the ones that I'm putting forward now, that they're all by Smyth. As I've already said, he does appear to have owned quite a number of works on plague. His interest in demography is indicated by his praise of John Grant, my old acquaintance, as an understanding man of quick wit and a pretty scholar, and by his ownership of at least one copy of Grant's Natural and Political Observations on the Bills of Mortality. And, as I want to show, there is also some evidence for his owning bills of mortality and plague bills. The sale catalogue, which we already looked at, lists 3 lots of particular relevance in the section Bundles of Stitched Books in Quarto English. The first, item 140, comprised John Grant, Natural and Political Observations on the Bills of Mortality, Act for Preventing Fires in London, J. Bell's Bills of Mortality for 18 years, with 2 more treatises concerning London. And the first of these is presumably an unbound copy of Grant, though the book is elsewhere described as octavo. He certainly owned, as I said, a copy of the 1662 edition, and a copy of the 1665 edition is also listed in the sale catalogue. The third item must be John Bell, London's Remembrancer, or a true account of every particular week's christenings and mortality in all the years of pestilence, blah, 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 blah. And Bell's work, which is published before the end of October in 1665, focuses on the presentation of mortality figures for this and earlier plague years in order to correct the many and gross mistakes which have been imposed upon the world by divers ignorant scribblers, especially in a recent work published anonymously entitled Reflections on the Weekly Bills of Mortality. And this particular lot was bought for 2 shillings and 4pence by a Mr. Rawlett, who bought other lots, mostly to do with church doctrine, in Smyth's sale. And then 2 more lots in, again, the same category, bundles of stitched books in quarto, English, are described respectively as a bundle of weekly bills of mortality for London. I think you can read all that, I don't have to read it out. And both these lots were bought by Narcissus Luttrell for 6 and 2pence and 2 and 6pence respectively, suggesting that the first lot was substantially larger or more interesting than the second. And obviously one of the challenges to my proposition that these items belong to Smyth is that the second bundle continues well after the date of his death in 1675. But I think the way I would get around this is by saying that I think it's possible, and indeed quite plausible, that his daughter and executrix Martha Hacker, who inherited the library and who may well have been living with him, simply continued to subscribe and preserve the weekly bills up to her own death in 1681. These 2 descriptions, or these 2 lots, fit quite well with items now in Guildhall Library. The 2 bundles with Guildhall Library A1, 5, 96 and 97, which are quarto books of weekly bills of mortality bound in the 19th century after their acquisition by the library, and the parcel of old bills of mortality, etc., in King Charles I's time, with the broadsides under discussion. The exact date at which these were acquired by the library hasn't yet been traced. They have a 19th century accession book, but it's not specific enough to know exactly what it is, let alone where they got it from. The first volume, and the 2 volumes you can see there, comprises in sequence a copy of Bell's London Remembrancer, an incomplete set of weekly and yearly bills dating from 1661 to 1664, the parish clerk's London's Dreadful Visitation of 1666, a volume of weekly bills for which is a volume of the weekly bills for 1665, a yearly bill for 1665, weekly and yearly bills for 1666 to 8, yearly bills for 69 and 70, weekly and yearly bills for 1671. So not a complete sequence, but broadly speaking covering the years from just before the plague up to 1671. Most of the bills, though not the ones that form part of books, show signs of having once been spiked or threaded. Some of them show signs of having been folded in 3. They've been carefully flattened and mended, probably by the 19th century binder, who's done a very nice job, and the whole very slightly cropped. The second volume, 97, contains a complete sequence of weekly and yearly bills from 1671 to 1681, and again most of the weekly bills seem to have been spiked, and only some, but not all of the yearly bills. And I obviously can't say whether that's the seller's means of storing and distributing them, or whether it's the owner's means. So I think there's quite a lot of, apart from the sale catalogue descriptions and the way they fit broadly with what we've been talking with these 2 volumes, I think there's also some evidence for Smyth's ownership of these actual bills apart from that general match. In GLA 1596, on the weekly bill for September 1666, there's a manuscript note of the fire's beginning and end, and on 97, on the weekly bill for April 1673, there's a note in a similar hand against the report of 27 people drowned at St Margaret, Westminster, that these were soldiers newly pressed coming out of the country, drowned in the ferry boat. Both of these observations occur within Smyth's lifetime, and the hand, I think, certainly resembles his. His habit of annotation is noted by Richard Chiswell in his preface to the sale catalogue, where he said that Smyth entered memorable and very useful remarks upon very many of the books under his own hand, and indeed in the numerous items in the catalogue itself that are described as bearing observations or annotations by Smyth. Most strikingly, however, bound in with volume 97, between the last weekly bill for 1676 and the yearly bill for 1676, there's a folded paper, slightly smaller than the bills, with a discussion of the bill's cause of death category overlaid, and it's signed with the initials RS. And the following folios, the rest of this folded paper, contain extracts from ecclesiastical constitutions and rituals in Latin on the same subject. The hand is again similar to at least one of Richard Smyth's hands, and he quite often added his initials to sections of his writing. Here are some other examples. The top one is from the thing I'm just talking about, the others are from ones that are known to be Smyth's. And at least 3 of the works that are being quoted in those extracts about the category overlay, which is babies' cot deaths or babies smothered in bed with their parents or nurses. At least 3 of the works from which he's quoting were in the sale catalogue of Smyth's library, and the style of excerpting and quoting from authorities is just so characteristic of him. So, for example, his work on the English bishops is essentially a compilation of information from other sources. Precisely the kind of thing you don't want your students to do. It's a sort of, it's an attributed pastiche, you could say. And that much of his other writing is also like this. It's full of excerpts that are identifiable and traceable, but that aren't sorted out in any particular or meaningful way. So I think there's a good case for thinking that those 2 bound volumes of bills may well represent the bundles of bills of mortality in Smyth's sale catalogue. The parcel of old bills of mortality, etc., in King Charles I time, part of lot 231, in the bundles of stitched books in quarto, is harder to identify with certainty because the description's so vague. But I think that at least 3, and probably as many as 13, of the single sheet broadsides, yearly bills, composite bills, other plague material, dating from 1603 to 1665, now in Guildhall Library, can be plausibly identified as one Smyth's. The 1665 Morning Cross, which I've already mentioned, is one. So too is a copy of the 1636 Red Cross, or England's Lord Have Mercy, annotated not only with mortality figures, but also in the margin with notes of other historic plagues. The handwriting on the face of these is very like Smyth's, and the annotations on the Red Cross are in his style. Both of these are endorsed with writing at least similar to Smyth's that appears to reiterate the printed title, but the endorsements are now hard to read because the sheets have been backed with plain paper. It's not clear at what time this was done, but all of those that are single sheet printings now have paper backing. The only one that doesn't is this one, in which the printing runs onto 2 sides. And Advice to the Poor by Way of Cure and Caution by Thomas Cock in 1665. I think the 13 I'm talking about, whose endorsements are largely lost, all are to some degree legible. They're all in exactly the same sort of format. They repeat the title and the date, and that they're all positioned in the same sort of way. So I think that these really do make up a set. The endorsement on the Cock broadside is useful because of the way that it links, for example, with things that are known to be endorsed by Smyth, for example, in British Library Sloane Manuscript 1710. Some of the other items have figures on the face, all of them in a hand that could be Smyth's, but isn't always distinctive enough for certainty. And what these 13 broadsides are, there are 3 standard format yearly bills for 1603, 1625, 1633, 2 versions of the Red Cross composite bill for 1625 and 1636, 4 different Lord Have Mercy composite bills from 1636, and the Morning Cross from 1665. There are Remedies Against the Infection of the Plague by John Belson of 1665, Observations of Mr. Lilly of 1665, and Thomas Cock's Advice for the Poor of 1665. And I won't go into all the details about how they're endorsed and annotated. I do want to say that I'm not suggesting absolutely everything with writing on is by Smyth, and this is by way of reminding you that this is another a famous 1665 London's Lord Have Mercy on Us, whose writing is not, of course, easy to see. but I think that it's although it's obviously good 17th century hand, it's not Smyth's. It has quite distinctive letter forms. And I think what's happened is that quite a lot of broadsides have been acquired by Guildhall Library at one time or another, and that the order in which they're now kept doesn't reflect the way they were brought together. You know, there are some that might be Smyth's mixed up with some that might not. The fact that they've all been backed suggests an attitude to 17th century print that we might not now share. So although I don't think it can be proved beyond doubt that these plague broadsides were owned and annotated by Smyth, I think there's a really strong probability that, and I think, and I'm taking this as a justification for this wider exploration of his experience of plague, his interest in demography, vital statistics, and therefore, in a sense, is the justification for this whole paper. So if I'm right, or at least possibly right, in arguing that these particular bills of mortality and plague broadsides did belong to Richard Smyth, what does this add to our understanding of his experience? What was he, or any other annotator, actually doing? And I think we can see at least three different strands to his interest in this material. The first is simply typographical and bibliographical. The second is his desire to obtain, perfect and organise information on plague as on other subjects. And the third is tentatively an interest in the actual content of the works he collected. As far as typographical bibliographical goes, Smyth is a collector of printed books from a huge range of printers and places. He's interested in early printed works. He has an amazing collection of Caxtons. He drafted a text on the history of printing that debates where it originated and who first brought it to England. So he's interested in print per se. He also collected, as I said, quite a lot of current printed pamphlets and ephemera on political and religious subjects from the 1640s and 50s. So it may be that the variant copies of the Lord Have Mercy from 1636 and the two copies of the Red Cross from 1625 and 1636 could perhaps just have been valued as interesting examples of print. As Montaigne and Jenner have shown, and as these images show, they are impressive examples of the typographer's art. On the collection and organisation of facts, including statistics about plague, I think this is how I see his engagement with the weekly bills of mortality and the composite bills, complementing his known practice of compiling extensive collections of excerpts on topics such as printing, bishops, church dedications and saints, and wonders. We also know that he liked to correct and perfect copies of printed works by collating variants or supplying text from one copy to another. The 1636 Red Cross, shown here, has been annotated in two hands, the first in the centre of the sheet, filling in some weekly mortality figures, and the second in the margins, adding information on historic plagues. And I'm sorry about the fact that I had to photograph them through plastic. I hope I will be allowed on some occasion to photograph them without. I think the second set of annotations on this provides a link to his compilations. The information they contain could well have been derived from other works that he owned. The text of the broadside, which largely repeats that of the 1625 Red Cross broadside, recites the major plagues of early modern London, the numbers that died, and the marginal annotations give dates and numbers for epidemics in Constantinople, Germany and Italy, and a couple of references to plagues in 1347 to 8. I don't know when these annotations were made. I'm inclined to say that the figures not by Smyth that fill in data for 1636 might be quite early, might be contemporary with the printed one. I don't necessarily think that Smyth was owned and annotated this as early as 1636. Another one of the Lord Have Mercies prints weekly figures for various parishes up to 14th of July, and then leaves blank columns for the rest of the year and blanks for the totals. And in this one, every line for the weekly totals has been filled in by hand, apparently all at one time. But if so, this could not have been done until after December 1636 and could again be much later. Finally, the Morning Cross of 1636 also appears to have been annotated after the end of the year. And I'm sorry that, it's not just the fault of the screen, but this has come out quite blurred. the main thing to say is that it looks very even, just casting an eye over it. It looks to me as though somebody has filled in all those figures from August to the end of the year at one time. It's not one after another. And there are a couple of other entries or corrections on the face. So, for example, 1591 has been corrected to 1592. And then in the right and the lower margin, and here I think it is week by week, someone has added weekly figures, weekly totals, weekly plague totals for the whole city from the end of December 1665 up to the 30th of October 1666. And these are written, it looks as though the pen has been taken out and lines drawn and continues on like that. So in that case, he seems to be doing something rather different. So in this case and the Lord have mercy, as far as I can see, the annotator, Smyth, has not marked up the composite plague bill with the figures as they were published, as the printer may have intended. What he's actually done is to complete the broadside at the end of the year, probably from the yearly bill published in late December. So his aim seems to have been to improve or perfect the bills with their partial totals so that the content was complete, even though this information duplicated that contained in the weekly bills that he already collected. And this is partly typical of him in the various examples of where he has supplied pages or missing sections from books that he owned. And this mixture of doing it all at one time and doing it successively is also true of the copy of the Lord have mercy annotated by somebody else. For the third strand, the three advice broadsides actually may represent Smyth's chosen reading in time of plague, along with the treatises he transcribed or translated, which I've already talked about. The Observations of Mr. Lilly discusses the origins and cause of plague and offers both a prayer to be used in all families and several excellent receipts and approved medicines. Its principal recommendation is prayer and penitence, but it also lists various preventatives and cures said to have been proven in the plague of 1625. These are largely herbal and inexpensive, with some use of London treacle. Moderation in diet is recommended, but plague blisters in case of infection should be lanced and allowed to run. This text is followed by figures from the weekly bill of mortality for the week of July the 7th, and the hand that I believe to be Smyth's has written neatly on the face, weekly bill, 7 July 1665, and the sheet is endorsed with the title and the words weekly bill July 7, 1665, printed 1665. Sorry, I haven't got an image of this next one. The Remedies Against the Infection of the Plague, composed by John Belson, Esquire. That has a rather more hard sell approach. It has explicit directions about the fumigation of rooms and textiles, and a description of a perfumed bag, which is supposed to hang around your neck, celestial water, and a cordial tincture, and notes of where to buy them. The author advises that infected persons should be removed to the pest house to avoid further infection of the household. And this sheet also has a note in the bottom, August 1665, and is endorsed with the title printed 1665. And then Thomas Cox, Advice for the Poor by Way of Cure and Caution, which was published in or after August 1665. This too has a commercial object in that, in this case, to promote the printing and distribution of itself to poor families, so that those who couldn't afford to go to a physician could nurse their families with this helpful broadside for no more than 12p cost. And the medical basis is again Galenic, recommending temperance, sweating, vomits, and bleeding, and it gives recipes for plasters, ointments, and fumes, but it does also aim to sell a proprietary fume and lozenge and tells you where you can buy them. It has a commendation from the Duke of Albemarle and others dated 3rd and 4th of August. And Cox's aim is evidently to get the richer parishioners to subscribe or to subsidise the distribution of free copies to every family, especially the poorer sort. So it's actually possible that Smyth got his copy from his parish clerk, and as you can see, he's endorsed it, R. Cock, seek his advice to the poor of cure and caution, anno 1665. And it's certainly tempting, I think, to conclude that these broadsides were acquired and kept for their content, useful advice and information, though there are no comments to this effect. The medical advice they give is similar to that in the plague tracts that he transcribed, and that he translated or transcribed, I mean, again, still largely galenic and humoral, though they do offer immediate remedy in the form of patent medicines with information on where you can get hold of these. So what I'm in fact suggesting is that Smyth's response to plague was a mix of the real and the textual, and it may well be that this is the way in which I should think about it in relation to his response to other crises and problems. The latter entailed more than just reading. His acquisition and use of the bills of mortality and plague broadsides fits with larger patterns. He acquired contemporary and antiquarian texts on plague, possibly a large number of these. Some at least of these he read and excerpted. He took the trouble to transcribe and translate particular works at a time when plague, if fading, was still hanging over the city. He seems to have been exercised by the question of whether fleeing the plague was morally and socially legitimate, and to have addressed this in typical fashion by searching his collection for information and precedents. Like many other middling Londoners, he seems to have subscribed to the weekly bills of mortality. Perhaps unusually, he kept his collection in good order, and he also bought the yearly summary bills. He undertook a complicated collation of data on historic plagues and the current epidemic, and in this and in compiling his personal record of all such persons deceased as I knew in their lifetime, and the way in which he notes those who died of plague, I think this is a valuable addition to our understanding of the impact of plague on at least one 17th century Londoner. But this is not to discount the fact, despite his survival, that plague killed over 100,000 Londoners in his lifetime, and it destroyed many more lives and families. That he lived a comparatively quiet life, though not, as we've seen, one detached from the fears and dangers of the epidemics of his time, is in part, or in fact very largely, due to good fortune. Likewise, it was good fortune for him that halted the fire of 1666 some way short of his neighbourhood. His ability to survive the political vicissitudes of the century may be due to keeping his head down and avoiding controversy. So he was certainly lucky to lead this quiet life, but I think it perhaps also owes something to his personality. In general, he seems to have had a cheerful, phlegmatic temperament. He was on good terms with his family, his neighbours and his friends. He was far less troubled psychologically and mentally than his contemporary Nehemiah Wallington, who was racked by doubt and crises of faith as well as money problems. Even though we don't have the same personal writings that tell us so much about Wallington's troubles, the evidence from Smyth's life is of a much more of a calmer temperament. And indeed, Smyth's will, which has come out wrong. I'm sorry, you ought to be able to see Smyth's will here. This is something that sometimes happens with TIFFs or whatever. Never mind that. His will, which he actually made a few years before his death, beseeches God's gracious forgiveness for his sins, so that after this transitory life I may enjoy everlasting happiness with his elect.